हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू द लाइव सेशन। तो अब हम देखने वाले हैं एनसीईआरटी इकोनॉमिक्स, जिसमें आज हम देखेंगे क्लास 11 का, जो कि है इंडियन इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट। तो इसका आज हम फर्स्ट चैप्टर देखने वाले हैं, जो कि है इंडियन इकोनॉमी ऑन द ईव ऑफ इंडिपेंडेंस। तो शुरू करते हैं हमारा आज का चैप्टर। India is the pivot of our empire. If the empire loses any other part of its dominion, we can survive. But if we lose India, the sun of our empire will have set. Victor Alexander Bruce, the Viceroy of British India in 1894. Introduction. The primary objective of this book, Indian Economic Development, is to familiarize you with the basic features of Indian economy and its development as it is today in the aftermath of independence. However, it is equally important to know something about the country's economic past even as you learn about its present state and future prospects. So let us first look at the state of India's economy prior to country's independence and from an idea of the various considerations that shaped India's post-independence development strategy. The structure of India's present day economy is not just of current making, it has its roots steeped in history, particularly in the period when India was under British rule, which lasted for almost 2 centuries before India finally won its independence on 15 August 1947. The sole purpose of the British colonial rule in India was to reduce the country to being a raw material supplier for Great Britain's on rapidly expanding modern industrial base. An understanding of the exploitative nature of this relationship is essential for any assessment of the kind and level of development which the Indian economy has been able to attain over the last 6.5 decades. Low level of economic development under the colonial rule. India had an independent economy before the advent of the British rule, though agriculture was the main source of livelihood for most people. Yet the country's economy was characterized by various kinds of manufacturing activities. India was particularly well known for its handicraft industries in the fields of cotton and silk textiles, metal and precious stoneworks, etc. These products enjoyed a worldwide market based on the reputation of the fine quality of material used and the high standards of craftsmanship seen in all imports from India. Textile industry in Bengal. Muslin is a type of cotton textile which has its origin in Bengal, particularly places in and around Dhaka, spelled during the pre-independence period as Dhaka, now the capital city of Bangladesh. Dhakai muslin had gained worldwide fame as an exquisite type of cotton textile. The finest variety of muslin was called malmal. Sometimes foreign travelers also used to refer to it as malmal sahi or malmal khas, implying that it was worn by or fit for the royalty. The economic policies pursued by the colonial government in India were concerned more with the protection and promotion of the economic interest of their home country than with the development of the Indian economy. Such policies brought about a fundamental change in the structure of the Indian economy, transforming the country into supplier of raw materials and consumer of finished industrial products from Britain. Obviously, the colonial government never made any sincere attempt to estimate India's national and per capita income. Some individual attempts which were made to measure such incomes yielded conflicting and inconsistent results. Among the notable estimators, Dadabhai Naroji, William Digby, Findlay Series, V.K.R.V. Rao, and R.C. Desai. It was Rao whose estimates during the colonial period was considered very significant. However, most studies did find that the country's growth of aggregate real output during the first half of the 20th century was less than 2%, coupled with a mere 0.5% growth in per capita output per year. Agriculture during pre-British India. The French traveller Bernier described 17th century Bengal in the following way. The knowledge I have acquired of Bengal in 2 visits inclines me to believe that it is richer than Egypt. It exports in abundance cottons and silks, rice, sugar, and butter. It produces ample for its own consumption wheat, vegetable grains, fowls, ducks, and geese. It has immense herds of pigs and flocks of sheep and goats. Fish of every kind it has in profusion. From Rajmahal to the sea is an endless number of canals cut in bygone ages from the Ganges by immense labor for navigation and irrigation. Agricultural sector. India's economy under British colonial rule remained fundamentally agrarian. About 85% of the country's population lived mostly in villages and derived livelihood directly or indirectly from agriculture. However, despite being the occupation of such a large population, the agricultural sector continued to experience stagnation and not infrequently unusual deterioration. Agricultural productivity became low, though in absolute terms, the sector experienced some growth due to the expansion of the aggregate area under cultivation. This stagnation in the agricultural sector was caused mainly because of the various systems of land settlement that were introduced by the colonial government, particularly under the Zamindari system, which was implemented in the Bengal Presidency, comprising parts of India's present-day eastern states. The profit occurring out of the agriculture sector went to the zamindars instead of the cultivators. However, a considerable number of zamindars and not just the colonial government did nothing to improve the condition of agriculture. The main interest of the zamindars was only to collect rent regardless of the economic condition of the cultivators. This caused immense misery and social tension among the latter. To a very great extent, the terms of the revenue settlement were also responsible for the zamindars. Adopting such an attitude, dates for depositing specified sums of revenue were fixed, failing which the zamindars were to lose their rights. Besides this, low levels of technology, lack of irrigation facilities, and negligible use of fertilizers all added up to aggravate the plight of the farmers and contribute to the dismal level of agricultural productivity. There was, of course, some evidence of a relatively higher yield of cash crops in certain areas of the country due to commercialization of agriculture. But this could hardly help farmers in improving their economic condition, as instead of producing food crops, now they were producing cash crops, which were to be ultimately used by British industries back home. Despite some progress made in irrigation, India's agriculture was starved of investment in terracing, flood control, drainage, and desalination of soil. While a small section of farmers changed their cropping pattern from food crops to commercial crops, a large section of tenants, small farmers, and sharecroppers neither had resources and technology nor had incentive to invest in agriculture. Industrial sector. As in the case of agriculture, so also in manufacturing, India could not develop a sound industrial base under the colonial rule. Even as the country's world famous handicraft industries declined, no corresponding modern industrial base was allowed to come up to take pride of place so long enjoyed by the former. The primary motive of the colonial government behind this policy of systematically deindustrializing India was twofold. The intention was first to reduce India to the status of a mere exporter of important raw materials for the upcoming modern industries in Britain, and second, to turn India into a sprawling market for the finished products of those industries so that their continued expansion could be ensured to the maximum advantage of their home country, Britain. In the unfolding economic scenario, the decline of the indigenous handicraft industries created not only massive unemployment in India but also a new demand in the Indian consumer market, which was now deprived of the supply of locally made goods. This demand was profitably met by the increasing imports of cheap manufactured goods from Britain. During the second half of the 19th century, modern industry began to take root in India, but its progress remained very slow. Initially, this development was confined to the setting up of cotton and jute textile mills. The cotton textile mills, mainly dominated by Indians, were located in the western parts of the country, namely Maharashtra and Gujarat, while the jute mills, dominated by the foreigners, were mainly concentrated in Bengal. Subsequently, the iron and steel industries began coming up in the beginning of the 20th century. The Tata Iron and Steel Company (TISCO) was incorporated in 1907. A few other industries in the fields of sugar, cement, paper, etc. came up after the Second World War. However, there was hardly any capital goods industries to help promote further industrialization in India. Capital goods industries means industries which can produce machine tools which are in turn used for producing articles for current consumption. The establishment of a few manufacturing units here and there was no substitute to the near wholesale displacement of the country's traditional handicraft industries. Furthermore, the growth rate of the new industrial sector and its contribution to the gross domestic product (GDP) remained very small. Another significant drawback of the new industrial sector was the very limited area of operation of the public sector. This sector remained confined only to railways, power generation, communications, ports, and some other departmental undertakings. Foreign trade. India has been an important trading nation since ancient times, but the restrictive policies of commodity production, trade, and tariff pursued by the colonial government adversely affected the structure, composition, and volume of India's foreign trade. Consequently, India became an exporter of primary products such as raw silk, cotton, wool, sugar, indigo, jute, etc., and an importer of finished consumer goods like cotton, silk, and woolen clothes, and capital goods like light machinery produced in the factories of Britain. For all practical purposes, Britain maintained a monopoly control over India's exports and imports. As a result, more than half of India's foreign trade was restricted to Britain, while the rest was allowed with a few other countries like China, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and Persia, Iran. The opening of the Suez Canal further intensified British control over India's foreign trade. The most important characteristic of India's foreign trade throughout the colonial period was the generation of a large export surplus, but this surplus came at a huge cost to the country's economy. Several essential commodities, food, grains, clothes, kerosene, etc., were scarcely available in the domestic market. Furthermore, this export surplus did not result in any flow of gold or silver into India. Rather, this was used to make payments for the expenses incurred by an office set up by the colonial government in Britain, expenses on war again fought by the British government, and the import of invisible items, all of which led to the drain of Indian wealth. Trade through the Suez Canal. Suez Canal is an artificial waterway running from north to south across the Isthmus of Suez in northeastern Egypt. It connects Port Said on the Mediterranean Sea with the Gulf of Suez, an arm of the Red Sea. The canal provides a direct trade route for ships operating between European or American ports and ports located in South Asia, East Africa, and Oceania by doing away with the need to sail around Africa. Strategically and economically, it is one of the most important waterways in the world. Its opening in 1869 reduced the cost of transportation and made access to the Indian market easier. Demographic condition. Various details about the population of British India were first collected through a census in 1881. Though suffering from certain limitations, it revealed the unevenness in India's population growth. Subsequently, every 10 years, such census operations were carried out. Before 1921, India was in the first stage of demographic transition. The second stage of transition began after 1921. However, neither the total population of India nor the rate of population growth at this stage was very high. The various social development indicators were also not quite encouraging. The overall literacy level was less than 16%. Out of this, the female literacy level was at a negligible low of about 7%. Public health facilities were either unavailable to large chunks of population or when available were highly inadequate. Consequently, water and airborne diseases were rampant and took a huge toll on life. No wonder the overall mortality rate was very high, and in that particularly the infant mortality rate was quite alarming, about 218 per thousand in contrast to the present infant mortality rate of 40 per thousand. Life expectancy was also very low, 44 years in contrast to the present 68 years. In the absence of reliable data, it is difficult to specify the extent of poverty at that time, but there is no doubt that extensive poverty prevailed in India during the colonial period, which contributed to the worsening profile of India's population of the time. Occupational structure. During the colonial period, the occupational structure of India, that means distribution of working persons across different industries and sectors showed little sign of change. The agricultural sector accounted for the largest share of workforce, which usually remained at a high of 70 to 75%, while the manufacturing and the service sectors accounted for only 10 and 15 to 20% respectively. Another striking aspect was the growing regional variation. Parts of the then Madras Presidency, comprising areas of the present-day states of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, and Karnataka, Bombay, and Bengal, witnessed a decline in the dependence of the workforce on the agricultural sector, with a commensurate increase in the manufacturing and the service sectors. However, there had been an increase in the share of workforce in agriculture during the same time in states such as Odisha, Rajasthan, and Punjab. Infrastructure. Under the colonial regime, basic infrastructure such as railways, ports, water transport, posts, and telegraphs did develop. However, the real motive behind this development was not to provide basic amenities to the people but to subserve various colonial interests. Roads constructed in India prior to the advent of the British rule were not fit for modern transport. The roads that were built primarily served the purposes of mobilizing the army within India and drawing out raw materials from the countryside to the nearest railway station or the port to send these to faraway England or other lucrative foreign destinations. There always remained an acute shortage of all-weather roads to reach out to the rural areas during the rainy season. Naturally, therefore, people mostly living in this area suffered grievously during natural calamities and famines. The British introduced the railways in India in 1850 and it was considered as one of their most important contributions. The railways affected the structure of the Indian economy in two important ways. On the one hand, it enabled people to undertake long distance travel and thereby break geographical and cultural barriers, while on the other hand, it fostered commercialization of Indian agriculture, which adversely affected the self sufficiency of the village economies in India. The volume of India's export undoubtedly expanded, but its benefits rarely occurred accrued to the Indian people. The social benefits which the Indian people gained owing to the introduction of the railways were thus outweighed by the country's huge economic loss. Along with the development of roads and railways, the colonial dispensation also took measures for developing the inland trade and sea lanes. However, these measures were far from satisfactory. The inland waterways at times also proved uneconomical, as in the case of the coast canal on the Odisha coast. Though the canal was built at a huge cost to the government exchequer, yet it failed to compete with the railways, which soon traversed the region running parallel to the canal and had to be ultimately abandoned. The introduction of the expensive system of electric telegraph in India similarly served the purpose of maintaining law and order. The postal services, on the other hand, despite serving a useful public purpose, remained all through inadequate. You will learn more about the present status of British infrastructure in Chapter 8. Conclusion. By the time India won its independence, the impact of the 2 century long British colonial rule was already showing on all aspects of the Indian economy. The agriculture sector was already saddled with surplus labor and extremely low productivity. The industrial sector was crying for modernization, diversification, capacity building, and increased public investment. Foreign trade was oriented to feed the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Infrastructure facilities, including the famed railway network, needed upgradation, expansion, and public orientation. Prevalence of rampant poverty and unemployment required welfare orientation of public economic policy. In a nutshell, the social and economic challenges before the country were enormous. Recap. An understanding of the country of the economy before independence is necessary to know and appreciate the level of development achieved during the post-independence period. Under the colonial dispensation, the economic policies of the government were concerned more with the protection and promotion of British economic interests than with the need to develop the economic condition of the colonized country and its people. The agricultural sector continued to experience stagnation and deterioration despite the fact that the largest section of Indian population depended on it for sustenance. The rule of the British Indian government led to the collapse of India's world-famous handicraft industries without contributing in any significant manner to its replacement by a modern industrial base. Lack of adequate public health facilities, occurrence of frequent natural calamities and famines pauperized the helpless Indian people and resulting in engendering high mortality rates. Some efforts were made by the colonial regime to improve infrastructure facilities, but these efforts were spiced with selfish motives. However, the independent Indian government had to build on this base through planning. तो इसी के साथ हमारा फर्स्ट चैप्टर कंप्लीट हो गया है और ये एक छोटा चैप्टर था। तो अभी हम सेकंड चैप्टर शुरू करेंगे जो कि है इंडियन इकोनॉमी 1950 to 1990। तो ये चैप्टर अभी हम शुरू करते हैं। The central objective of planning in India is to initiate a process of development which will raise the living standards and open out to the people and new opportunities for a richer and more varied life. First 5-year plan. Introduction. On 15 August 1947, India woke to a new dawn of freedom. Finally, we were masters of our own destiny after some 200 years of British rule. The job of nation building was now in our own hands. The leaders of independent India had to decide, among other things, the type of economic system most suitable for our nation, a system which would promote the welfare of all rather than a few. There are different types of economic systems, and among them, socialism appealed to Jawaharlal Nehru the most. However, he was not in favor of the kind of socialism established in the former Soviet Union, where all the means of production, that means all the factories and farms in the country, were owned by the government. There was no private property. It is not possible in a democracy like India for the government to change the ownership pattern of land and other properties of its citizen in the way that it was done in the former Soviet Union. Nehru and many other leaders and thinkers of the newly independent India sought an alternative to the extreme versions of capitalism and socialism. Basically sympathizing with the socialist outlook, they found the answer in an economic system which, in their view, combined the best features of socialism without its drawbacks. In this view, India would be a socialist society with a strong public sector but also with private property and democracy. The government would plan for the economy, with the private sector being encouraged to be part of the planned effort. The Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948 and the directive principles of the Indian Constitution reflected this outlook. In 1950, the Planning Commission was set up with the Prime Minister as its chairperson. The era of 5-year plans had begun. Types of economic system. Every society has to answer 3 questions. What goods and services should be produced in the country? How should the goods and services be produced? Should producers use more human labor or more capital, machines for producing things? How should the goods and services be distributed among people? One answer to these questions is to depend on the market force of supply and demand. In a market economy, also called capitalism, only those consumer goods will be produced that are in demand. That means goods that can be sold profitably either in the domestic or in the foreign markets. If cars are in demand, cars will be produced, and if bicycles are in demand, bicycles will be produced. If labor is cheaper than capital, more labor intensive methods of production will be used, and vice versa. In a capitalist society, the goods produced are distributed among people not on the basis of what people need but on the basis of purchasing power, the ability to buy goods and services. That is, one has to have money in the pocket to buy it. Low cost housing for the poor is much needed but will not count as demand in the market sense because the poor do not have the purchasing power to back the demand. As a result, this commodity will not be produced and supplied as per market forces. Such a society did not appeal to Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, for it meant that the great majority of people of the country would be left behind without the chance to improve their quality of life. A socialist society answers the 3 questions in a totally different manner. In a socialist society, the government decides what goods are to be produced in accordance with the needs of society. It is assumed that the government knows what is good for the people of the country, and so the desires of individual consumers are not given much importance. The government decides how goods are to be produced and how they should be distributed. In principle, distribution under socialism is supposed to be based on what people need and not on what they can afford to purchase. Unlike under capitalism, for example, a socialist nation provides free health care to all its citizens. Strictly, a socialist society has no private property since everything is owned by the state. In Cuba and China, for example, most of the economic activities are governed by the socialistic principles. Most economics are mixed economics. That means the government and the market together answer the three questions of what to produce, and how to distribute what is produced. In a mixed economy, the market will provide whatever goods and services it can produce well, and the government will provide essential goods and services which the market fails to do. What is the plan? A plan spells out how the resources of a nation should be put to use. It should have some general goals as well as specific objectives, which are to be achieved within a specified period of time. In India, plans are of 5 years duration and are called 5-year plans. We borrowed this from the former Soviet Union, the pioneer in national planning. Our plan documents not only specify the objectives to be attained in the 5 years of a plan but also what is to be achieved over a period of 20 years. This long-term plan is called perspective plan. The 5-year plans are supposed to provide the basis for the perspective plan. It will be unrealistic to expect all the goals of a plan to be given equal importance in all the plans. In fact, the goals may actually be in conflict. For example, the goal of introducing modern technology may be in conflict with the goal of increasing employment. If the technology reduces the need for labor, the planners have to balance the goals. A very difficult job indeed. We find different goals being emphasized in different plans in India. Our 5-year plans do not spell out how much of each and every good and service is to be produced. This is neither possible nor necessary. The former Soviet Union tried to do this and failed. It is enough if the plan is specific about the sectors where it plays a commanding role, for instance, power generation and irrigation, while leaving the rest to the market. The goals of 5-year plans. A plan should have some clearly specified goals. The goals of the 5-year plans are growth, modernization, self-reliance, and equity. This does not mean that all the plans have given equal importance to all these goals. Due to limited resources, a choice has to be made in each plan about which of the goals to be given primary importance. Nevertheless, the planners have to ensure that, as far as possible, the policies of the plans do not contradict these 4 goals. Let us now learn about the goals of planning in some detail. Growth. It refers to increase in the country's capacity to produce the output of goods and services within the country. It implies either a larger stock of productive capital or a larger size of supporting services like transport and banking, or an increase in the efficiency of productive capital and services. A good indicator of economic growth in the language of economics is steady increase in the gross domestic product GDP. The GDP is the market value of all the goods and services produced in the country during a year. You can think of the GDP as a cake, and growth is increase in the size of the cake. If the cake is larger, more people can enjoy it. It is necessary to produce more goods and services if the people of India are to enjoy, in the words of the first 5-year plan, a more rich and varied life. Mahalanobis, the architect of Indian planning. Many distinguished thinkers contributed to the formation of our first 5-year plans. Among them, the name of the statistician Prasant Chandra Mahalanobis stands out. Planning is, in the real sense of the term, began with the second 5-year plan. The second plan, a landmark contribution to development planning in general, laid down the basic ideas regarding goals of Indian planning. This plan was based on the ideas of Mahalanobis. In first sense, he can be regarded as the architect of Indian planning. Mahalanobis was born in 1893 in Calcutta. He was educated at the Presidency College in Calcutta and at Cambridge University in England. His contribution to the subject of statistics brought him international fame. In 1946, he was made a fellow member of Britain's Royal Society, one of the most prestigious organizations of scientists. Only the most outstanding scientists are made members of this society. Mahalanobis established the Indian Statistical Institute (ISI) in Calcutta and started a journal, Sankhya, which still serves as a respected forum for statisticians to discuss their ideas. Both the ISI and Sankhya are highly regarded by statisticians and economists all over the world to this day. During the second plan period, Mahalanobis invited many distinguished economists from India and abroad to advise him on India's economic development. Some of these economists became Nobel Prize winners later, which shows that he could identify individuals with talent. Among the economists invited by Mahalanobis were those who were very critical of the socialist principles of the second plan. In other words, he was willing to listen to what his critics had to say, the mark of a great scholar. Many economists today reject the approach to planning formulated by Mahalanobis, but he will always be remembered for playing a vital role in putting India on the road to economic progress, and statisticians continue to profit from his contribution to statistical theory. The service sector. As a country develops, it undergoes structural change. In the case of India, the structural change is peculiar. Usually, with development, the share of agriculture declines and the share of industry becomes dominant. At higher levels of development, the service sector contributes more to the GDP than the other two sectors. In India, the share of agriculture in GDP was more than 50%, as we would expect for a poor country. But by 1990, the share of the service sector was 40.59%, more than that of agriculture or industry, like what we find in developed nations. This phenomenon of growing share of the service sector was accelerated in the post 1991 period. This marked the onset of globalization in the country, which will be discussed in subsequent chapter. The GDP of a country is derived from the different sectors of economy, namely the agricultural sector, the industrial sector, and the service sector. The contribution made by each of these sectors make up the structural composition of the economy. In some countries, growth in agriculture contributes more to the GDP growth, while in some countries, the growth in the service sector contributes more to the GDP growth. Modernization. To increase the production of goods and services, the producers have to adopt new technology. For example, a farmer can increase the output on the farm by using new seed varieties instead of using the old ones. Similarly, a factory can increase output by using a new type of machine. Adoption of new technology is called modernization. However, modernization does not refer only to the use of new technology, but also to changes in social outlook, such as the recognition that women should have the same rights as men. In a traditional society, women are supposed to remain at home while men work. A modern society makes use of the talents of women in the workplace, in banks, factories, schools, etc. And such a society, in most occasions, is also prosperous. Self-reliance. A nation can promote economic growth and modernization by using its own resources or by using resources imported from other nations. The first 7 five-year plans gave importance to self-reliance, which means avoiding imports of those goods which could be produced in India itself. This policy was considered a necessity in order to reduce our dependence on foreign countries, especially for food. It is understandable that people who were recently freed from foreign domination should give importance to self reliance. Further, it was feared that dependence on important food supplies, foreign technology, and foreign capital may take India's sovereignty vulnerable to foreign interference in our policies. Equity. Now, growth, modernization, and self reliance by themselves may not improve the kind of life which peoples are living. A country can have high growth, the most modern technology developed in the country itself, and also have most of its people living in poverty. It is important to ensure that the benefits of economic prosperity reach the poor sections as well instead of being enjoyed only by the rich. So in addition to growth, modernization and self-reliance, equity is also important. Every Indian should be able to meet his or her basic needs such as food, a decent house, education and healthcare, and inequality in the distribution of wealth should be reduced. Let us now see how the first 7 5-year plans covering the period 1950 to 1990 attempted to attain these four goals and the extent to which they succeeded in doing so. With reference to agriculture, industry, and trade, we will study the policies and development issues taken up after 1991 in Chapter 3. Agriculture. You have learnt in Chapter 1 that during the colonial rule there was neither growth nor equity in the agricultural sector. The policymakers of independent India had to address these issues, which they did through land reforms and promoting the use of high yielding varieties SYV seeds, which ushered in a revolution in Indian agriculture. Land reforms. At the time of independence, the land tenure system was characterized by intermediaries, variously called zamindars, jagidars, etc., who were merely collected rent from the actual tillers of the soil without contributing towards improvements on the farm. The low productivity of the agriculture sector forced India to import food from the United States of America. Equity in agriculture called for land reforms, which primarily referred to change in the ownership of land holdings. Just a year after independence, steps were taken to abolish intermediaries and to make the tillers the owners of land. The idea behind this move was that ownership of land would give incentives to the tillers to invest in making improvements provided sufficient capital was made available to them. Ownership and incentives. The policies of land to the tiller is based on the idea that cultivators will take more interest, they will have more incentive in increasing output it if they are the owners of the land. This is because ownership of land enables the tiller to make profit from the increased output. Tenants do not have the incentive to make improvements on land since it is the landowner who would benefit more from higher output. The importance of ownership in providing incentives is well illustrated by the carelessness with which farmers in the former Soviet Union used to pack fruits for sale. It was not uncommon to see farmers packing rotten fruits along with fresh fruit in the same box. Now, every farmer knows that the rotten fruits will spoil the fresh fruits if they are packed together. This will be a loss to the farmers since the fruits cannot be sold. So, why did the Soviet farmers do something which would so obviously result in loss for them? The answer lies in the incentives facing the farmers. Since farmers in the former Soviet Union did not own any land, they neither enjoyed the profits nor suffered the losses. In the absence of ownership, there was no incentive on the part of farmers to be efficient, which also explains the poor performance of the agricultural sector in Soviet Union despite availability of vast areas of highly fertile land. Land selling was another policy to promote equity in the agricultural sector. This means fixing the maximum size of land which could be owned by an individual. The purpose of land ceiling was to reduce the concentration of land ownership in a few hands. The abolition of intermediaries meant that some 200 lakh tenants came into direct contact with the government. They were thus freed from being exploited by the zamindars. The ownership conferred on tenants gave them the incentive to increase output, and this contributed to growth in agriculture. However, the goal of equity was not fully served by abolition of intermediaries. In some areas, the former zamindars continued to own large areas of land by making use of some loopholes in the legislation. There were cases where tenants were evicted and the landowners claimed to be self-cultivators, the actual tillers, claiming ownership of the land. And even when the tillers got ownership of the land, the poorest of the agricultural laborers, such as sharecroppers and landless laborers, did not benefit from land reforms. The land ceiling legislation also faced hurdles. The big landlords challenged the legislation in the courts, delaying its implementation. They used this delay to register their lands in the name of close relatives, thereby escaping from the legislation. The legislation also had a lot of loopholes which were exploited by the big landholders to retain their land. Land reforms were successful in Kerala and West Bengal because these states had governments committed to the policy of land to the tiller. Unfortunately, other states did not have the same level of commitment, and vast inequality in landholding continues to this day. The Green Revolution. At independence, about 75% of the country's population was dependent on agriculture. Productivity in the agriculture sector was very low because of the use of old technology and the absence of required infrastructure for the vast majority of farmers. India's agriculture vitally depends on the monsoon, and if monsoon fell short, the farmers were in trouble unless they had access to irrigation facilities, which very few had. The stagnation in agriculture during the colonial rule was permanently broken by the Green Revolution. This refers to the large increase in the production of food grains resulting from the use of high-yielding variety HYV seeds, especially for wheat and rice. The use of these seeds required the use of fertilizers and pesticides in the correct quantities as well as regular supply of water. The application of these inputs in correct proportions is vital. The farmers who could benefit from HYV seeds required reliable irrigation facilities as well as the financial resources to purchase fertilizer and pesticide. As a result, in the first phase of the Green Revolution, approximately mid-1960s up to mid-1970s, the use of HYV seeds was restricted to more affluent states such as Punjab, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. Further, the use of HYV seeds primarily benefited the wheat growing regions only. In the second phase of the Green Revolution, mid-1970s to mid-1980s, the HYV technology spread to a large number of states and benefited more variety of crops. The spread of Green Revolution technology enabled India to achieve self-sufficiency in food grains. We no longer had to be at mercy of America or any other nation for meeting our nation's food requirements. Growth in agricultural output is important, but it is not enough if a large proportion of this increase is consumed by the farmers themselves instead of being sold in the market. The higher output will not make much of a difference to the economy as a whole. If, on the other hand, a substantial amount of agricultural produce is sold in the market by the farmers, the higher output can make a difference to the economy. The portion of agricultural produce which is sold in the market by the farmers is called marketed surplus. A good proportion of the rice and wheat produced during the Green Revolution period, available as marketed surplus, was sold by the farmers in the market. As a result, the price of food grains declined relative to other items of consumption. The low income groups who spend a large percentage of their income on food benefited from this decline in relative prices. The Green Revolution enabled the government to procure sufficient amount of food grains to build a stock which could be used in times of food shortage. While the nation had immensely benefited from the Green Revolution, the technology involved was not free from risk. One such risk was the possibility that it would increase the disparities between small and big farmers. Since only the big farmers could afford the required inputs, thereby reaping most of the benefits of the Green Revolution. Moreover, the HYV crops were also more prone to attack by pests, and the small farmers who adopted this technology could lose everything in a pest attack. Fortunately, these fears did not come true because of the steps taken by the government. The government provided loans at a low interest rate to small farmers and subsidized fertilizers so that small farmers could also have access to the needed inputs. Since the small farmers could obtain the required inputs, the output on small farmers equaled the output on large farms in the course of time. As a result, the Green Revolution benefited the small as well as rich farmers. The risk of the small farmers being ruined when pest attacks their crops was considerably reduced by the services rendered by research institutes established by the government. You should note that the Green Revolution would have favored the rich farmers only if the state did not play an extensive role in ensuring that the small farmers also gains from the new technology. The debate over subsidies. The economic justification of subsidies in agriculture is at present a hotly debated question. It is generally agreed that it was necessary to use subsidies to provide an incentive for adoption of the new HYV technology by farmers in general and small farmers in particular. Any new technology will be looked upon as being risky by farmers. Subsidies were therefore needed to encourage farmers to test the new technology. Some economists believe that once the technology is found profitable and widely adopted, subsidies should be phased out since their purpose has been served. Further, subsidies are meant to benefit the farmers, but a substantial amount of fertilizer subsidy also benefits the fertilizer industry, and among farmers, the subsidy largely benefits the farmers in the more prosperous regions. Therefore, it is argued that there is no case for continuing with fertilizer subsidies. It does not benefit the target group and it is a huge burden on the government's finances. On the other hand, some believe that the government should continue with agriculture subsidies because farming in India continues to be a risky business. Most farmers are very poor and they will not be able to afford the required inputs without subsidies. Eliminating subsidies will increase the inequality between rich and poor farmers and violate the goal of equity. These experts argue that if subsidies are largely benefiting the fertilizer industry and big farmers, the correct policy is not to abolish subsidies but to take steps to ensure that only the poor farmers enjoy the benefits. Thus, by the late 1960s, Indian agricultural productivity had increased sufficiently to enable the country to be self-sufficient in food grains. This is an achievement to be proud of. On the negative side, some 65% of the country's population continued to be employed in agriculture even as late as 1990. Economists have found that as a nation becomes prosperous, the proportion of GDP contributed by agriculture as well as the proportion of population working in the sector declines considerably. In India, between 1950 and 1990, the proportion of GDP contributed by agriculture declined significantly, but not the population depending on it. 67.5% in 1950, 64.9% by 1990, which was such a large proportion of the population engaged in agriculture, although agricultural output could have grown with much less people working in the sector. The answer is that the industrial sector and the service sector did not absorb the people working in the agricultural sector. Many economists call this an important failure of our policies followed during 1950 to 1990. Prices as signals. You would have learned in an earlier class about how prices of goods are determined in the market. It is important to understand that prices are signals about the availability of goods. If a good becomes scarce, its prices will rise, and those who use this good will have the incentive to make efficient decisions about its use based on the price. If the price of water goes up because of lower supply, people will have the incentive to use it with greater care. For example, they may stop watering the garden to conserve water. We complain whenever the price of petrol increases and blame it on the government. But the increase of petrol price reflects greater scarcity, and the price rise is a signal that less petrol is available. This provides an incentive to use less petrol or look for alternate fuels. Some economists point out that supplies do not allow prices to indicate the supply of a good. When electricity and water are provided at subsidized rate or free, they will be used wastefully without any concern for their scarcity. Farmers will cultivate water-intensive crops if water is supplied free. Although the water resources in that region may be scarce, and such crops will further deplete the already scarce resource. If water is priced or to reflect scarcity, farmers will cultivate crops suitable to the region. Fertilizers and pesticides subsidies will subsidies result in overuse of resources which can be harmful to the environment. Subsidies provide an incentive for wasteful use of resources. Think about subsidies in terms of incentives and ask yourself whether it is wise from the economic viewpoint to provide free electricity to farmers. Industry and trade. Economists have found that poor nations can progress only if they have a good industrial sector. Industry provides employment which is more stable than the employment in agriculture. It promotes modernization and overall prosperity. It is for this reason that the 5-year plans place a lot of emphasis on industrial development. You might have studied in the previous chapter that at the time of independence, the variety of industries was very narrow. Largely confined to cotton, textiles, and jute. There were two well-managed iron and steel farms, one in Jamshedpur and the other in Kolkata. But obviously we needed to expand the industrial base with a variety of industries if the economy was to grow. Public and private sectors in Indian industrial development. The big question facing the policymakers was what should be the role of the government and the private sector in industrial development. At the time of independence, Indian industrialists did not have the capital to undertake investment in industrial ventures required for the development of our economy. Nor was the market big enough to encourage industrialists to undertake major projects even if they had capital to do so. It is principally for these reasons that the state had to play an extensive role in promoting the industrial sector. In addition, the decision to develop the Indian economy on socialist lines led to the policy of the state controlling the commanding heights of the economy, as the second 5-year plan put it. This meant that the state would have complete control to those industries that were vital for the economy. The policies of the private sectors would have to be complementary to those of the public sector, with the public sector leading the way. Industrial Policy Resolution 1956 (IPR 1956). In accordance with the goal of the state controlling the commanding heights of the economy, the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956 was adopted. This resolution formed the basis of the second five-year plan. The plan which tried to build the basis for the socialist pattern of society. This resolution classified industries into three categories. The first category comprised industries which would be exclusively owned by the state. The second category consisted of industries in which the private sector could supplement the efforts of the state sector, with the state taking the sole responsibility for starting new units. The third category consisted of the remaining industries which were to be in the private sector. Although there was a category of industries left to the private sector, the sector was kept under the state control through a system of licenses. New industries was allowed unless a license was obtained from the government. This policy was used for promoting industries in backward regions. It was easier to obtain a license if the industrial unit was established in an economically backward area. In addition, such units were given certain concessions such as tax benefits and electricity at lower tariff. The purpose of this policy was to promote regional equality. If an existing industry had to obtain a license for expanding output or for diversifying production, producing a new variety of goods, this was meant to ensure that the quantity of goods produced were not more than what the economy required. License to expand production was given only if the government was convinced that the economy required a larger quantity of goods. Small scale industry. In 1955, the Village and Small Scale Industries Committee, also called the Carfe Committee, noted the possibility of using small scale industries for promoting rural development. A small scale industry is defined with reference to the maximum investment allowed on the assets of a unit. This limit has changed over a period of time. In 1950, a small scale industrial unit was one which invested a maximum of rupees 5 lakh. At present, the maximum investment allowed is rupees 1 crore. It is believed that small scale industries are more labor intensive, that means they use more labor than the large scale industries and therefore generate more employment. But these industries cannot compete with big industrial farms. It is obvious that development of small scale industries requires them to be shielded from the large farms. For this purpose, the production of a number of products was reserved for the small scale industry. The criterion of reservation being the ability of these units to manufacture the goods. They were also given concessions such as lower excise duty and bank loans at lower interest rate. Trade policy, import substitution. The industrial policy that we adopted was closely related to the trade policy. In the first 7 plans, trade was characterized by what is commonly called as inward-looking trade strategy. Technically, this strategy is called import substitution. This policy aimed at replacing or substituting imports with domestic production. For example, instead of importing vehicles made in a foreign country, industries would be encouraged to produce them in India itself. In this policy, the government protected the domestic industries from foreign competition. Protection from imports took two forms: tariffs and quotas. Tariffs are a tax on imported goods. They make imported goods more expensive and discourage their use. Quotas specify the quantity of goods which can be imported. The effect of tariffs and quotas is that they restrict imports and therefore protect the domestic farms from foreign competition. The policy of protection is based on the notion that industries of developing countries are not in a position to compete against the goods produced by more developed economies. It is assumed that if the domestic industries are protected, they will learn to compete in the course of time. Our planners also feared the possibility of foreign exchange being spent on import of luxury goods if no restrictions were placed on imports. Nor was any serious thought given to promote exports until the mid 1980s. Effect of policy on industrial development. The achievements of India's industrial sector during the first seven plans are impressive indeed. The proportion of GDP contributed by the industrial sector increased in the period from 11.8% in 1950 to 51 to 24.6% in 1990 to 91. The rise in the industry's share of GDP is an important indicator of development. The 6% annual growth rate of the industrial sector during the period is commendable. No longer was Indian industry restricted largely to cotton, textiles, and jute. In fact, the industrial sector became well diversified by 1990, largely due to the public sector. The promotion of small scale industries gave opportunities to those people who did not have the capital to start large farms to get into business. Protection from foreign competition enabled the development of indigenous industries in the areas of electronics and automobile sectors which otherwise could not have developed. In spite of the contribution made by the public sector, the growth of the Indian economy, some economists are critical of the performance of many public sector enterprises. It was proposed at the beginning of this chapter that initially public sector was required in a big way. It is now widely held that state enterprises continue to produce certain goods and services, often monopolizing them, although this is no longer required. An example is the provision of telecommunication service. This industry continued to be reserved for the public sector even after it was realized that private sector firms could also provide it. Due to the absence of competition, even till the late 1990s, one had to wait for a long time to get a telephone connection. Another instance could be the establishment of modern bread, a bread manufacturing firm, as if the private sector could not manufacture bread. In 2001, this farm was sold to the private sector. The point is that after 4 decades of planned development of Indian economy, no distinction was made between what the public sector alone can do and what the private sector can also do. For example, even now only the public sector supplies national defense. And even though the private sector can manage hotels well, yet the government also runs hotels. This has led to some scholars to argue that the state should get out of areas which the private sector can manage and the government may concentrate its resources on important services which the private sector cannot provide. Many public sector firms incurred huge losses but continue to function because it is difficult to close a government undertaking even if it is a drain on the nation's limited resources. This does not mean that private firms are always profitable. Indeed, quite a few of the public sector firms were originally private firms, which were on the verge of closure due to losses. They were then nationalized to protect the jobs of the workers. However, a loss-making private firm will not waste resources by being kept running despite the losses. The need to obtain a license to start an industry was misused by industrial houses. A big industrialist would get a license not for starting a new farm but to prevent competitors from starting new farms. The excessive Regulation of what came to be called the permit license Raj prevented certain farms from becoming more efficient. More time was spent by industrialists in trying to obtain a license or lobby with the concerned ministries rather than on thinking about how to improve their products. The protection from foreign competition is also being criticized on the ground that it continued even after it proved to do more harm than good. Due to restrictions on imports, the Indian consumers had to purchase whatever the Indian producers produced. The producers were aware that they had a captive market, so they had no incentive to improve the quality of their goods. Why should they think of improving quality when they could sell low quality items at a high price? Competition from imports forces our producers to be more efficient. A few economists also point out that the public sector is not meant for earning profits but to promote the welfare of the nation. The public sector funds on this view should be evaluated on the basis of the extent to which they contribute to the welfare of people and not on the profits they earn. Regarding protection, some economists hold that we should protect our producers from foreign competition as long as the rich nations continue to do so. Owing to all these conflicts, economists call for a change in our policy. This, along with other problems, led the government to introduce a new economic policy in 1991. Conclusion: the progress of the Indian economy during the first 7 plans was impressive indeed. Our industries became far more diversified compared to the situation at independence. India became self sufficient in food production thanks to the Green Revolution. Land reforms resulted in abolition of the hated Zamindari system. However, many economists became dissatisfied with the performance of many public sector enterprises. Excessive government regulation prevented growth of entrepreneurship. In the name of self-reliance, our producers were protected against foreign competition, and this did not give them the incentive to improve the quality of goods that they produced. Our policies were inward oriented and so were failed to develop a strong export sector. The need for reform of economic policy was widely felt in the context of changing global economic scenario, and the new economic policy was initiated in 1991 to make our economy more efficient. This is the subject of our next chapter. Recap: after independence, India emphasized an economic system which combines the best features of socialism and capitalism. This culminated in the mixed economy model. All the economic planning had been formulated through 5-year plans. Common goals of 5-year plans are growth, modernization, self-sufficiency, and equity. The major policy initiatives in agriculture sector were land reforms and green revolution. These initiatives helped India to become self-sufficient in food grains production. The proportion of people depending on agriculture did not decline as expected. Policy initiatives in the industrial sector raised its contribution to GDP. One of the major drawbacks in the industrial sector was the inefficient functioning of the public sector as it started incurring losses leading to drain of the nation's limited resources. तो इसी के साथ हमारा सेकेंड चैप्टर भी कंप्लीट होता है और ये है इस चैप्टर का एक्सरसाइज। तो हमारा आज का सेशन ये वाला यहीं तक था। तो अगर आप चैनल पे न्यू हैं तो चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और बेल आइकन पर क्लिक कर दीजिए ताकि आप डेली लाइव क्लास ज्वाइन कर सकें। और अगर आपको वीडियो अच्छा लगे तो लाइक कर दीजिए। तो हमारा आज का सेशन यहीं तक था। थैंक यू, थैंक्स फॉर ज्वाइनिंग।